Look closely at this shape. A small rectangular object with a curved handle, held down at a figure's side, gripped like something being carried rather than displayed. You will find it carved into temple walls in ancient Iraq. You will find something that looks remarkably similar on Assyrian palace reliefs 1,000 years later. And across the internet, in dozens of videos with dramatic music and slow zooms, you will find people insisting this proves something enormous. That ancient civilizations on opposite sides of the planet were secretly in contact, that beings from somewhere beyond our understanding taught humanity everything from writing to mathematics, and that professional archaeology has known this for years and quietly looked away. It is a gripping story. It is also, when you actually sit down and check it against the historical and archaeological record, mostly untrue. And the real story behind this object is, in its own way, more interesting than the myth, because it is a story about how convincing a false pattern can look and how much discipline it takes to tell the difference between a real discovery and a good-looking coincidence. Let's start with the part of this that is genuinely well established, because there is more truth here than skeptics sometimes give credit for. The object really does appear across a long stretch of Mesopotamian art. You can find versions of it in early Sumerian imagery, on cylinder seals used to sign documents, and on monuments like the Stele of the Vultures, one of the oldest surviving war memorials in human history. You can find it again, unmistakably, a full 1,000 years later, carved into the palace walls of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, whose reign began around 883 BC. There, winged figures stand beside a stylized tree, one hand extended with a small cone-shaped object, the other holding this same rectangular container down at their side. These figures are not ordinary humans in the Assyrian visual language. They are carved larger than life, some winged, many wearing the tiered horned headdress that Mesopotamian art reserved almost exclusively for beings of divine or semi-divine status. Assyriologists call them apkallu, usually translated as sages or wise ones, and ancient Mesopotamian texts do describe figures like this as teachers who brought humanity knowledge, writing, law, irrigation, the measurement of time. None of this is fringe material. It sits comfortably inside mainstream university coursework on ancient Near Eastern religion, and scholars have written about the apkallu tradition for well over 100 years. It's also true, and worth taking seriously, that ancient Mesopotamian texts describe certain culture heroes in ways that read almost like records rather than folklore. The tradition names specific sages. Adapa, sometimes called Wana, is described as the first of them, associated with the city of Eridu and credited with bringing the arts of civilization to humankind before a great flood. Later texts list which sage served which king, in a kind of chronological sequence, the way you might list a line of advisors. This has genuinely struck scholars as an unusual way to write about beings who are, by every other measure, treated as mythological. That strangeness is real, and it's one of the reasons the apkallu tradition remains an active, debated topic in Assyriology rather than a settled footnote. Here is where the popular internet version of this story starts to pull away from the evidence, though, and it's worth being precise about exactly where that happens. The object these apkallu figures carry has an accepted identification among specialists who actually study Assyrian religious iconography. It is generally read as a ritual bucket, paired with a cone-shaped object in the other hand, which is usually interpreted as an instrument used in a purification or fertilization rite directed at the sacred tree, sprinkling water, or some symbolic substance, in a repeated ceremonial gesture. This isn't a guess thrown out to explain away a mystery. It's an interpretation built from comparing hundreds of very similar palace reliefs, cross-referencing them with Mesopotamian religious texts describing purification rituals, and situating the imagery within a broader pattern of tree-tending scenes that recur across Assyrian palace art. In other words, this is a known object in a known ritual context, discussed in scholarly literature for well over a century. The claim that professional archaeologists glanced at it, shrugged, wrote decorative motif in their notes, and refused to look closer simply doesn't hold up. They looked. They looked for a very long time. They arrived at a conclusion that happens to be less cinematic than unidentified device of unknown purpose, which is exactly why it doesn't make for viral video content. Now to the claim doing the heaviest lifting in most of these videos. The idea that a team of researchers measured this object across hundreds of carvings spanning 3,000 years and several continents, and found the height-to-width ratio clustering with remarkable, almost impossible precision around 1 to 1.2, with matching handle curvature, matching depth, matching everything, in cultures that supposedly had no way of ever contacting one another. This is presented as hard, quantifiable, scientific evidence. It is the detail that gives the story its authority, because numbers feel objective in a way that visual impressions don't. But if you go looking for the actual study, the lead analyst's name, the institution, the journal it was published in, the dataset of 350 cataloged images, none of it exists in any searchable, citable form. No peer-reviewed archaeology or Assyriology journal has published research matching this description. This exact set of claims, often with nearly identical phrasing, circulates across a cluster of videos and blog posts online, almost always without a named source, which is one of the more reliable signs that a piece of content is copying another piece of content rather than reporting on real research. A genuine cross-continental statistical study of this kind, if it existed, would be a legitimately newsworthy piece of archaeological science, and it would be citable by name. The fact that it isn't should carry real weight in how much trust you extend to everything built on top of it. So what's actually going on when people notice a bag-like shape in Mesoamerican carvings, or at Göbekli Tepe, or on the Gateway of the Sun in Bolivia? Mostly, it's a very human tendency called pareidolia, the same mental habit that makes people see a face in the front of a car, or an animal shape in a cloud. Once your brain has been primed to look for a rectangle with a curved handle, it becomes extremely good at finding rough matches to that shape almost anywhere, especially in ancient art, which is full of stylized bundles, baskets, bags, and ceremonial objects to begin with. Carrying a container is one of the most ordinary human actions imaginable, and cultures across the world independently developed art depicting people holding baskets, bundles, and pouches, because baskets and bundles are things people everywhere actually carried. Finding a bag-shaped object in the hand of a Mesoamerican figure isn't evidence of contact with Sumer any more than finding a triangular shape in two unrelated cultures is evidence they shared a secret about triangles. Some of the specific Mesoamerican images most often cited in these videos are, according to specialists in that region's art, more plausibly identified as woven ceremonial bundles or incense pouches, objects with their own well-documented independent history in Mesoamerican ritual practice, stretching back long before any theoretical contact with the ancient Near East would have been possible. The Göbekli Tepe claim deserves special attention because it's the most dramatic beat in this kind of video, and it's also the one built on the shakiest ground. Göbekli Tepe, in southern Turkey, is real, and it is genuinely one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last several decades. Its massive carved stone pillars, raised by hunter-gatherer communities roughly 11,000 years ago, predate agriculture, pottery, and writing by thousands of years, and its existence forced archaeologists to seriously rethink what pre-agricultural societies were capable of organizing and building. That part of the story needs no exaggeration. It's already remarkable on its own terms. But the carvings at Göbekli Tepe are dominated by animals: foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, alongside abstract T-shaped pillars whose full symbolic meaning is still actively debated by the excavation team and outside researchers alike. There is no excavation report, no publication from the archaeologists who actually work at the site, identifying a handbag motif as an established feature of its iconography. When a video describes specific shapes there as handles arched, bodies squared, sitting in a row like objects on a shelf, that's a writer choosing how they want you to interpret an ambiguous carved shape, not a documented finding reported by the people who excavated it. It's worth pausing on why this particular kind of story is so effective, because understanding that is arguably more useful than debunking any single claim inside it. These videos work by braiding a handful of completely real, well-documented facts: Sumer's genuine and extraordinary achievements, the real existence of the Apkallu tradition in Mesopotamian religion, the real and startling age of Göbekli Tepe, together with one much weaker, largely unsourced claim placed right in the middle. Your trust in the true parts extends naturally to the unverified part because your brain doesn't file information source by source. It absorbs a narrative as a whole. On top of that, the story leans on one of the most durable narrative structures there is, the idea that mainstream science is hiding an inconvenient truth, and that a lone curious researcher stumbled onto it and was quietly shut out. This framing flatters the viewer for being open-minded and skeptical of the establishment, while never requiring the storyteller to name who exactly is suppressing what, or to produce any actual paper trail proving it. In reality, funding gets rejected constantly for all kinds of mundane, unglamorous reasons: budget limits, competing priorities, unconvincing methodology, and that ordinary friction of academic life is very different from evidence of a cover-up. None of this means the true history here is dull. Quite the opposite. Sumer, without any embellishment at all, is one of the most staggering stories in the entire human record, a farming society on a flat, hot floodplain between two rivers that, within a remarkably short span, invented the first true writing system on Earth, produced some of the earliest law codes ever recorded, divided time and the circle into units we still use today, and tracked the motion of the planets with a level of mathematical precision that continued to impress astronomers thousands of years later. The Apkallu tradition, with its bucket and its cone and its purification rites tied to a sacred tree, is a real and still debated piece of ancient religious practice, one that scholars continue to study and argue about using texts and comparative iconography. You don't need lost civilizations or beings from beyond the world to make any of that compelling. The actual open question, how a society with seemingly no direct predecessor managed to develop so much, so quickly, and what its people genuinely believed about the towering winged figures on their palace walls, is a real historical mystery, one that historians and archaeologists are still working through carefully, using excavation, texts, and comparison, not calipers applied to unrelated shapes on the other side of the planet. So, if there's an honest answer to the question these videos love to end on, is it coincidence on a scale we've never seen? Is it contact between civilizations history refuses to admit? Or is it one real object carried by real beings and remembered the same way by everyone who ever saw it? The honest answer is none of those. It's a real, well-documented ritual object belonging to one specific ancient tradition, loosely resembling a much wider, completely unremarkable pattern of humans everywhere drawing people holding containers, because carrying things in containers is simply one of the most ordinary activities a human being can do. The mystery was never in the stone. It was in how easily a striking image, stripped of its context and stitched to a few unrelated pictures from far away, can be made to look like proof of something it never actually was.